Okay, what an amazing 3 days, and we're almost drawing to a close. So we had the most incredible session this morning with 5 speakers talking about contract cheating, and now we sort of bring it all together with a panel. We're so very lucky to have 4 experts in very different ways about contract cheating. We've got Thomas, Phil, Shiva and Chloe. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and their particular interest about contract cheating, just so you know where they're coming from. They've been told 2 to 3 minutes at the most. Once they've introduced themselves and you know about their particular interest in contract cheating, then we're going to open the floor so you can ask as many questions as you like. Now, I know we've had a very tight schedule for 3 days. Here's your chance, 1 whole hour, to speak to 4 people who've thought a lot about contract cheating. So I'll pass over to our panel. I'll be chairing the session and making sure that you all have a chance to ask the questions you need. Over to you, Thomas.
So, hello everyone. I got the chance to speak to many of you in the room this morning at 9 o'clock, apart from the people who are still in bed, which was where I would have liked to have been. But I'm Thomas Lancaster from Staffordshire, where I've been working for a few months now. I spent most of my career at Birmingham City University in the UK. I think I'm known as having written the first paper using the terminology contract cheating, and having been quite visible in the field around the world since then, speaking about the area a lot, about the quite a lot of changing ways about which we'll approach the problem, from what was a problem of detection and of a problem of cracking down on cheating, to now looking at it much more of your academic integrity and working with students. So I just continue to be very interested in the wider field of what's happening involving technology, how the field has emerged. I've been doing a lot of work recently looking at the marketing of contract cheating services and the sort of way in which they operate, the background behind the sites. So I'm just generally interested in all the great work going on around contract cheating.
Hello. You're not supposed to laugh when I say hello.
It's the accent.
It's the accent, is it? I'm not going to try a different accent. Hello, my name's Phil Newton. I was fortunate enough to give a keynote yesterday, so I won't talk for too long. You've heard a lot about what I have to say and where I'm from, which is Swansea University in the UK. I'm relatively new to this field. My background's in neuroscience and life sciences research. Like many of us here, I stumbled across contract cheating by accident and have been interested in it for a few years now. My main reason for being interested in it is because I think it's potentially a threat to the quality and standards of higher education. But my main take on it really is that before we get to that conclusion, we really need to understand it. I mean, more research is needed so that we know what it is that we're trying to deal with, and we understand a bit more about it so we understand how we might deal with it.
Shiva, here's a microphone.
Hello, I'm Shiva from Nottingham, Trent University in UK. Again, just like Phil, my real interest I'm from pharmacology, but again I stumbled across the plagiarism and the contract cheating side of it. I am interested in working with the contract cheaters and try to find what is going on in their mind, and then try to address however way we can. I can't say we can stop it, however we can restrict the contract cheating.
Hi, good morning. I'm Chloe. I'm from Oxford. I'm a PhD student at Oxford. And I study similar to Shiva, actually. I look at contract cheaters, or academic writers as they're called, in Kenya. And so I'm interested also in their writing processes, in their lives and their reasons for working as academic writers or contract cheaters. And I'm really interested in the economy side of things, and contract cheating or academic writing as a form of employment as well.
Okay, fascinating. So very different perspectives on the panel. I'd like to open it up. If you can stand up. There are roving microphones going around the room. Put your hand up so we can get the microphone to you. Otherwise we won't be able to hear you in this big room. Wait for the microphone. When you ask your question, please introduce yourself and say where you're from, and then direct your question to one of the people on the panel.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel from Epigeum. My question for the panel, this may be easy, is do you think contract cheating has been normalised already, or is it in the process of normalisation? And what one single thing does the panel think could be done to tackle the normalisation issue?
How about, who do you think would like to take that question first? Phil? Yeah, there you go. Phil's ready.
No, I was just wondering why you were looking at me. When
I was looking at you because you're looking at me. There you go.
Has it been normalised? I hope not. By normalised, Rachel, do you mean that it's just a part of the academic culture in higher education? Is that the sort of thing you mean? So it's accepted that students are doing it?
Accepted, yeah, accepted behaviour amongst students and in the wider community.
I hope not. I don't think it is in terms of all students. I mean, certainly there are some students for whom it is common practice, and it possibly in some disciplines and in some particular institutions it's more common than others, but I don't think it's been normalised. The second part of your question, what's the one thing that we could do, I think relates to the first part. In order to understand whether it's been normalised and also to understand it a bit more, I think we probably have to work a bit more with students on this, have their input into what this is all about, why are they doing it, why do they think the services exist, why is it easier for them to use contract cheating services than so-called legitimate services.
Yeah, it's one of these very difficult questions to answer, and it does vary a lot depending on the region of the world. So I've been, along with other people in the audience, doing a lot of work around Southeast Europe recently, and one of the comments we did get from speaking to students there was along the lines of everyone's doing it. So we spoke to students who were writers for other students, and the view that I was told is that they all knew someone else on their course who they could use to write their assignments. So in some areas, there's probably this perception that it's normalised. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every student is contract cheating, but it does mean that there are enough people out there who think that it's common. Likewise, it doesn't mean that most students don't want to operate with integrity. Most students do. Most students do a degree because they want to gain the knowledge, they want to gain a good job. And so in terms of what we can do to work with students and improve things, I think it's really communicating that message alongside them. It's saying that we do teach them things for a reason. We're not just teaching them to become a very proficient essay writer, so they can then become someone working from the ghostwriting side of things afterwards, which has happened in the past and is clearly not the way to go forward. So it is also thinking about our pedagogical design of courses and making sure they're fit for purpose as well.
On that note, Shiva, I wondered if you wanted to respond to what Thomas just said about some students learning how to write essays so that they can then become ghostwriters themselves from your research. You might tell people what your recent paper was, for example.
Yeah. So I recently published a paper on Tracey's journal. I just by chance we tried to interview the contract cheaters. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, probably the others might disagree with me. I tried to generalize the cheaters, contract writers into three different categories. One is the well-established companies. Most of the time they are running in the Western countries. The other one is the well-established companies, but they outsource their contract to the Far Eastern countries. And the third one, the students from the Far Eastern countries who came to study to UK or other Western country, westernized education. And then when they go, that's the one I was interested. When they went back, they couldn't find enough employability for what the stuff they have studied. So, for example, I'm just giving a general introduction. Example is that a person from India come over here and study. Most of the time, we teach them molecular pharmacology, but when he goes over there, there is no scope for the molecular pharmacology. They can only do with the R&D development process of the producing drugs rather than inventing drugs. So many students, I'm not saying it's India, but in Southeast Asia, when they go back, they find the vacuum that they are highly skilled MSc with the MSc, but they couldn't progress anywhere. And then they get together and then they form a consortium to write up essays. The main problem there is, I mean, even some of our lecturers in our university do, is that they recycle the coursework. Because they are recycling the coursework, these students who studied 4 years ago with us, they know how to write it. And then the problem with that is they will make the same mistake as the normal student does. So it's very difficult to find out they are actually doing it. So one of the way we are trying to handle within our university is the fact that instead of offering the MSc, 1 year MSc, we are offering the 2 year MSc with the industrial placement in India or where they are coming from. So that we can, one of the problem with Southeast Asia is the employment market. So if the student is willing to work for free, the companies there, they will take them as an industrial placement student. By going there, we are more or less introducing a good student to the industry, and then if there is a chance of, and then they will learn about what the industry wants, and there's a chance for them to get employed there. Therefore, we can minimize. So we try to reduce, we are trying to reduce the chances of these students going into that trade. So, yeah.
I think that's a good segue for Chloe, because Chloe's interest is in the economics of it as well. Would you like to share with the audience your view about what Shiva was just saying?
So a similar type of scenario with the Kenyan writers that I've worked with, but slightly different in that they had not necessarily gone to universities in the UK or in the West more generally. What happens is that, first of all, I should say that about half of them in my study, so about 15 or so of them, were students themselves still in undergraduate level students. The others obviously were recent graduates, with the same challenge of not being able to find formal employment within Kenya, where they were, or not being able to use kind of the higher order skills, or finding jobs where they could use skills of analysis and writing and being able to use their degree in an effective way. So I guess, I mean, the take home about the economy of it is that in many ways, or in the employment side of it, I should say, in many ways it was seen as a substitute, hopefully a temporary substitute for more formal employment. But there was still a sense that it could be used for some of the writers, that this could become a career, because the payment in many cases is in US dollars or in euros, for example. And when you do the conversion, even though it may seem, okay, $2 a page or $3 a page, it's not a lot, maybe for someone living here. When you do the conversion into Kenyan shillings, for example, it can provide a livable wage, if you want to put it that way, for them.
So some interesting perspectives there in terms of not just the normalisation about our students thinking about it as the way to get the work done, but perhaps even becoming normalised in terms of being seen as a legitimate work practice. Interesting. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Associate Professor Kath Ellis from the University of New South Wales. I'd like to direct my question to Chloe. Do you think, in terms of the economics of this, is this another form, or a neo-colonial form of exploitation? Given the work, and Shiva, I'd be interested to hear your comment on this.
Chloe first.
I think certainly within the literature that I've been looking at for my thesis, lots of people have started to map the relations and the fact that it is work, and many times being offered by students or companies in the West, that's then being outsourced cheaply to Southeast Asia, to Sub-Saharan Africa. And so there's a sense that many of the patterns are being replicated there. And I should also say that part of what I'm starting to realize as I look more deeply into this as well, is that there is an issue that it is work, and I'm not a copyright, I'm not a copyright specialist, but it is a kind of intellectual labor that is being done that's not being acknowledged because, I mean, it's being passed off as their own work. But even if you start to look at that side of it, a lot of the patterns and a lot of the trends in terms of where the money is coming from, where it's going, and the fact that it's being outsourced cheaply do replicate kind of colonialist and neo-colonial patterns. So there's definitely that element to it. I actually asked some of the writers their perspectives on this and whether they felt that way. I mean, and the opinions vary, but I had candid conversations with some of them about the fact that, this is a student, in their mind, sometimes this is a student who just does not want to do the work, who is able, because $20 or $30 is not such a big amount for them, to then pass on work that in some of their minds they could be doing themselves, obviously, because, I mean, if you were at my talk yesterday, I talked about the fact, and other people have raised this issue as well, the fact that the students writing the assignments for them, in many cases, they're not specialists in their areas. They're writing them in a day, in 5 hours, 6 hours. They've not been to a class. They've never read a text. So I've actually had talks with some of the writers where it's like, I don't want to paint students as awful, but there is really a sense, I would like to play devil's advocate a little bit about in questioning or pushing further some of what the students have said about their reasons for employing contract tutors, because I think I wrote it down as I was listening to some of the talks this morning, question of time. Well, I think we've all said that time actually, the quick turnaround is one of the hallmarks or the key characteristics of the industry, that these writers have 6 hours, 7 hours, 2 days to do the assignment, so they're also pressed for time. Language, which came up a lot during the conference. In the Kenyan context, for sure, English would be second or third language in many cases for the writers. So they also, they may have mastered English better than some of the students, so I'm not suggesting that it's a level playing field in all cases, but there is a language issue for them too. And then, issues about not having a relationship with the lecturers and not being able to meet with the lecturers and go through the work. I think that's obvious because these people have never met the lecturers, they've never been to the class. So I just want to maybe push, it's a bit of a divergent, but maybe push some of the reasons that the students give a little bit more when we are considering the people sometimes, in some cases, that they are outsourcing the work to.
So in my case, what I have come across is the fact that these contract writers, they actually target the students from their own country. And then what they do is, I think some of you already know that I am a Facebook addict, so most of the time I spend my time on Facebook, and then I found out, but they know how to find out these students coming from their country to Western, and then they, instead of advertising as a Facebook advertisement, they are putting as a post. Mm-hmm. And in my paper I have given screenshots of these posts, and then less than 10% Turnitin report, and then you when you read it, then they will explain everything. So most of the time they know how to target as well. And then none of the writers I have interviewed or my colleagues have interviewed that they admitted that the Western students are using, but their target is their own country students. So that's the problem they have. And then these students, they trust them because they are advertising that I studied in this university. And some of them, I think even one of them has put the degree certificate from our university on this web page, saying that I am from this university and I know how their coursework assessment works. So, yeah.
And I think just to comment on the original question is, are these people being exploited who are writing? It doesn't mean I necessarily think it's right, but I do remember some work in the gig economy in the Philippines a few years ago where they were talking to people working in that economy who were working in it because of all the advantages of work from home, be your own boss, freedom, etc. And they found the people who were getting higher wages, who were getting bonuses from their employers, were actually being persecuted within their society. And they were the victims of crime because they had more than other people. So they don't necessarily want to stand out because of that. And I think it's really interesting just looking at the whole financial funnel and flow through these sites. I think some people were at my talk in Athens last summer where I went into this in a lot more detail. But if you look at where all the money goes through the process, a huge amount of it is just filtered off in advertising, trying to get the leads, get the customers, to give them discounts, to keep them there. Even companies like Google take a lot of money through these services when they say they may be banned from advertising, but it's very easy to get adverts up on Google, paid adverts, where you may be paying a few pounds, a few dollars for everyone who clicks through, but knowing that a substantial number of those will buy. So the money that goes to the very bottom of the funnel, which is the writers, is very low. A lot of it is creamed off by the company who's taking the order, but not doing the legwork, and a huge amount of it goes to the advertising funnel along the way.
I think Chloe would like to respond to your comments.
Yeah.
Thomas?
Yeah.
I think just to say that I think the picture is fuller, probably a little bit more nuanced than you're painting. Certainly in some cases with the writers that I've worked with, as I said before, the wage is a livable wage, and in some cases it is better than the wages that they're getting within formal employment in their own countries. I don't think that necessarily means that the exploitation is not taking place, because first of all, that's not necessarily the case for everyone in every type of writing or in the gig economy more generally. It's certainly the wages vary. The working hours and working conditions vary obviously a lot. And then there's still a broader issue within the gig economy about working conditions and the fact that it's casual labor, so there's very little job security. There are all kinds of issues around there. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that exploitation is not taking place, in a kind of carte blanche type of statement. Yeah.
Okay, interesting discussion. Next question.
Hi, I'm Hans Getchley from the National Union of Students in the UK. We're doing some work to provide some guidance on this issue for our member students' unions. And a couple of questions to the whole panel, really. So in our guidance, we're thinking about the political framing of the issue. So my first question is, if we think that higher stakes or endpoint assessment tempts students to cheat more, is there a way that we can co-design assessment which is still valuable, but maybe slightly lower stakes, and that involves students as partners in a more democratic learning experience? And then a second, maybe...
Let's start with one question to begin, because there's an awful lot happening there. I might ask Phil to respond to this to start with, and then open it up to the panel about co-designing assessment with students.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's something that's very prominent in UK higher education literature at the moment, the idea of co-creation of various aspects of learning. I think this idea that a volume of assessment towards the end of a period of learning, which is very high stakes, might promote academic misconduct. I think there's something to that. It probably promotes all sorts of other things that aren't very healthy as well, and anyone who's been a student will remember those weeks leading up to exam period. Whether the answer to that is to have more frequent lower stakes assessment, I think is something that just needs working through. Another very common topic in UK higher education at the moment is the burden of assessment, the idea that some students are over-assessed. Of course, there's a disconnect between those two things, right? If you have more lower stakes assessments, fewer higher stakes assessments, you're going to have more assessment overall. I personally think that's not such a bad thing if assessment is more standard and normal part of learning, because we do know that assessment drives learning, and we do know that it promotes good learning, and all sorts of cognitive psychology about what promotes and prompts people to learn things, to remember things, to be able to do things, is that if they frequently practice them for an assessment. And I think it's perhaps not a question that's directly relevant to the conversation we're having here, but a reframing of what assessment means, so that it's something positive from which everybody benefits, and we can see how people are doing and students can see how they've learned and can progress with good feedback, is something that would be really valuable in general, but would also help with some of these cheating issues that you raised.
Yeah, I mean, Phil's covered most of the points I was going to make, particularly about the burden of assessment. That's the one thing that comes to me as someone who's led courses and been very involved with teaching, not so much now, but particularly looking at that side of things. And the other area where we get held up in the UK is with quality processes in terms of getting assessments approved by external bodies, in terms of working with the requirements of professional bodies that often are quite dictate how students will be assessed a lot and what needs to be in a course. I mean, there are some professional bodies, for instance, in the UK to do with engineering that require quite a large component of exams. So we always have to work within those requirements as well. So in theory, I love the idea of co-creation. In practical terms, the tight time frame of a semester's teaching and trying to get the skills there and trying to get a well-designed assessment out in conjunction with students makes it quite difficult, as does really the quite bitty process of education spread around often large teaching teams across different years, and sometimes a lack of continuity. So I think there are wider problems that unfortunately have to be solved before we can co-design for current students. But where we can make progress, and it does happen, is in reviewing assessment at the end of a module to improve it for the next set of students and to make changes based on that.
Did anyone else on the panel want to respond to that particular question? Hannah, is it?
Yep.
You had a second part to your question.
I did. So this is slightly unrelated, but going back to the political framing of the issue that we're looking at within our national union. In the UK, we've obviously just seen a raft of massive legislative change, opening up the higher education market to much more competition. And I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on how far contract cheating and essay mills are a symptom of a more heavily marketised higher education system, and what others' experiences were from the international community on this.
Well, I know we've all got lots to say about that. Thomas, you picked the microphone up, so you start.
Well, I'll give a relatively brief answer to this, because Hannah and I have spoken before anyway, so she probably knows my opinion, but just to share it with everyone else, that of course the marketisation of higher education has caused a lot of challenges with how we teach, how we assess, what students expect as consumers. And that's the position we're in. It's not something that is likely to change, but there is the argument put forward that students are contract cheating because of paying high fees. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Again, from our research in Southeast Europe and in other places, we're seeing high levels of contract cheating in countries that don't have fees, that in many cases they provide grants to students. So it's not such a simple discussion as that. I think what is happening is that some students in the UK and elsewhere are using the high fees as an excuse for contract cheating, and that's something we have to solve in different ways.
How long have we got? I think Thomas has made a lot of the points. I do think there is something to the idea that as higher education becomes more of a product that people purchase with contracts in terms of conditions, it's going to change the way students and the people who work in higher education and everyone involved view what they do on a day-to-day basis. And it seems reasonable to assume, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, that might drive some students to view obtaining what they want from this contract through more easily available means as a more desirable option. So contract cheating may be promoted. But I do think there's a wider issue to be considered here about contract cheating itself. It is a business. It's a market-driven industry, And I think we mustn't lose sight of that when we try and understand where it's coming from and what we want to do about it. I think I made this point yesterday and it's worth reiterating. We found up to 1,000 English language sites. They don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because there's a need for them to exist. Let me frame that very carefully. There's a demand for them. And so where does that come from? You know, why is there such a demand for these sites to exist? And tackling the need for them, the demand for them, might be a better way of us understanding what we can do to try and prevent it.
Chloe, you were nodding your head vigorously. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Not particularly, just,
No, just
just agreeing.
Just
really,
agreeing.
just agreeing.
Okay, was there anyone in the audience who wanted also to respond to that idea of marketisation of higher education, links with contract cheating in any way before we move on? No? Okay. Wait, Deb.
I've got the microphone. I'm Deborah Weberwolf from the HEW Berlin in Germany. I first want to thank Chloe for her presentation and the work that she's doing, because I find it so vital to get the perspective of the ghostwriter, or academic writer as you're calling them, which is probably a better word, into this discussion, because we've only been focusing on the students for so long. My question to you, and then perhaps also to Shiva, because I didn't realize that you were also looking from ghostwriter perspective, is have you been able to compare ghostwriters from different cultural situations to see, do they work differently, are the economics different, or are they more or less the same everywhere?
Yeah, well, the short answer is no, I haven't. But I mean, going off of what I've heard from Shiva before, I think there's a lot of comparison there, but there also seems to be key differences. So I think it's an area that we can definitely start exploring more vigorously. But no,
I agree with you as well. Maybe it's giving me an idea that probably we can combine our results and then probably redo another session with them if they are still around. That will be, because my perspective is more or less a Southeast Asian country, so yours is different. So probably there might be some differences in between contractors.
Yeah. You know, and it would be really interesting work. There's so much valuable research work still to do in this area just to understand it. And I don't think we should lose sight either that there are a lot of UK, Australian, Canadian, American, etc. based writers as well. It's not purely that work is being outsourced to economies where the values are cheap and people are using English as a second language. I've been in contact with ghostwriters as well, who, for some reason, I'm the person they want to confess all to, which is, and some research and people who've wanted to be legitimate writers on sites and have found the type of work which is being sent to them is academic writing, despite what they thought it would be. And so there are some people who can write very high quality work. They probably charge no more than the sites themselves, but they just get the work directly. So students who are going through those, I think you sort of covered as well a bit, Tracey, in your keynote, that students don't necessarily go to a site, they go to a respected person who will provide the work. And so they can get good work back. I mean, it's amazing speaking to writers, and they tell you all the little tricks they do, the way they deliberately introduce mistakes to produce work if the student has said they only want a 2-2 standard, or a 3rd standard, or a lower standard of work, how they can look at a writing style of a student and try and copy that. I suspect they don't do it that well to fool some good stylometric analysis, but they do it well enough to fool a layperson who's looking at 200 essays in a row to mock. So there are things they do. And they also introduce, as I found recently, they introduce their own political opinions, they introduce their own jokes to keep themselves interested and excited while they're writing. In some cases, I've heard of people, they write the reflection for a student, and they've written the reflection about a student of the wrong gender because they don't know who they're writing for, but yet this doesn't get picked up when it's marking. So it does say something about ghostwriters can very easily fool us by turning out several essays a night because they're good at writing essays.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of people with their hands up.
Hi, Lisa Morladis from the American College of Greece. I just want to have Tracey and Teddy's here probably somewhere.
Teddy's down the front.
Hi, Teddy. So it was interesting because it's actually more of a comment because 4 years ago at the San Antonio conference, when we almost had the conference in Princeton, which got canceled, Dave Tomar was going to be one of the speakers, one of the presenters there. For those of you who may not understand the name, may not recognize the name, he's the one that wrote the book, The Shadow Scholar. And I remember that there was a lot of controversy, among the board itself about having Dave Tomar come. So getting the perspective of the ghostwriter or the contractor. And I did a presentation, in fact, exactly on this and on the marketing perspective of these sites where I met Phil. But what is interesting to me now is 4 years down the line, and of course everything evolves, and I understand the interest in the psychology as well, and what we can learn from the ghostwriters themselves, or whatever name we give to them. But I can't help but wonder, again, about how it was controversial then, and where we've gone now, and so we've, I guess, decided that it is much more important to learn from them, whether it's the tricks or what it is that we can do to somehow keep ahead of the game. And I wonder if we're ever going to be ahead of the game, or if we're always going to be, playing cat and mouse. And ultimately, whether we lose something, not to the ones who somehow more maybe legitimately or sincerely confess, as you said, Thomas, a minute ago, to the one person, about the one person who came to you, but how we may be giving, some legitimacy, because I feel that Dave Tomar achieved that with everything that he did with his book and wanting to become a writer, and all of a sudden all the attention he got. I think he finally achieved what he wanted to. So I'm just kind of putting that out.
Feel free to comment.
Yeah, I think Dave Tomar did achieve legitimacy, but if he hadn't done that, someone else would, because there've been smaller scale stories of ghostwriters confessing all in the past. So he wasn't the first one, he was just the first one to make it into a major book and to expand it and to get a very good amount of coverage in our community. I'm not sure how far it's expanded to the wider community when, let's face it, we still have academics who haven't heard of contract cheating or say there's no way their students would consider doing it. And we're sort of talking about how far that view has gone to the public as a whole. So I think he's probably paved the way for some people to see that as a career, but it's just part of the wider economy that's seen a lot more people working in the gig economy, doing content writing for websites, being the new journalists, writing for magazines and blogs, and all the other types of writing and online work they can do.
Yeah, there's just a couple of things I want to say really. The first was just to remark upon the point that Litz was making about the ICAI conference. I think it was 2013. There were 55 separate sessions at that conference over 3 or 4 days. There were a great number of delegates. And there was one session about contract cheating, and there were 12 of us there, although Litz remembers it as 15. Either way, it was a small number. And it's clear that we've come a very long way in a short space of time in terms of understanding this issue and trying to get to the bottom of it and doing something about it. I would be interested actually, if there's time at the end, in hearing from anyone who thinks that maybe there's too much attention being focused on it now, because that is an occasional criticism that comes up. In terms of the legitimacy of the writers and the role of Dave Tomar and that whole aspect, I remember some of the controversy. I wasn't directly involved, but I remember talking to people about the article that he wrote in the Chronicle and then the book that he wrote. And a lot of the controversy came from the fact that people were horrified that someone was doing this, and even more horrified that they could be perceived to be exploiting what they had done for their own personal gain, and what a terrible person they were, and so on. And I think one of the things that has happened in the last few years is we've perhaps matured a little bit in our view of that, and recognised that the writers, as the world's been presented here, shows they're earning a living, and in many cases where there are very few options, or the options aren't very good. And whether we accept that or not is a slightly different question, but certainly we have to understand where that's coming from, because that helps us understand the problem.
Okay, I saw other people with their hands up. Oh, great. Go ahead, Shannon.
Okay, so I was just gonna look up this article online, because I know it's out there. But I'm from the University of Minnesota, in the Minneapolis area in Minnesota in the United States. And we're a really large institution anyways. I'm the person who runs the office. It's called the Office for Student Conduct and Academic Integrity. So I was reading everything about cheating. And I read an article in like about 2010 maybe, where they talked about, I don't think the term had come up yet, contract cheating. I don't know when that term started being used. But I don't remember it being called that. I just remember reading this article about these people who were writing these papers for our students, and I thought, there is no way we'll catch this. And I was sort of mortified by it at the time, like, because it was sort of a new thing to me to think about this. But here's what I want to know from you all. If any of you guys do you know if anyone is doing research to find out, and this I got from this article, they are interviewing some of the people writing these papers were our very own faculty who are moonlighting, doing this. Is anyone doing the research to find out anything about that?
We did. I reported it yesterday in the keynote. Go ahead. You remember the numbers?
Yes, I mean there are. We didn't catch your name, I don't think. Sharon. Yes, I think there are anecdotal stories about that. That came up in some of the OLT research that Tracey presented a couple of days ago. I forget the exact numbers. I'll defer to you for that.
So you might remember in our data we asked our staff, had they ever provided an assignment to a student to be used, either giving it to them or selling it to them, and we only had 4 staff members out of our group that had admitted that. A small number.
While they were a staff member.
I can't remember if we actually specified that, did we? I think we just said, have you ever? Maybe while teaching. Yeah.
So I thought I remembered that as being, have you ever, like in your past?
No, that was a question about have you ever in your past life contract cheated yourself as a student. But we also asked our staff if they had ever themselves provided materials to students to give them an unfair advantage. And 4 out of 1,147 or something said they had. So it's quite a small number. I had the sense, I was really interested in this, I had the sense that we were going to get a lot more staff saying they'd done it. Because my sense is that it happens more often. We had a scandal in my own university about that. So I don't know, maybe staff were reluctant to report it. But 4 people did out of 1,100 odd. So it was a tiny number, but I think it is more common than we know.
If I come back on that, there was a question that came up yesterday from Eric, I think it was Eric Bork at Coventry, who asked it, or a point that he made actually, that if you think about where it comes from the writer's perspective, the work we've heard here, if you think about some of the terms and conditions that many academics are employed under, sessional contracts, fixed-term contracts, short-term contracts, low wages, no job security, no benefits, etc., you can see a situation is created where for some, the idea of writing essays, which as academics they're probably quite good at, hopefully, is an attractive option.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why they said they did it, is they needed the extra money and it paid really well.
Yeah, and I mean, just very briefly, 2006 was the first paper published at the just Plagiarism conference in Newcastle, UK that year, based on data sort of from 2004 onwards. But it certainly wasn't the first time contract cheating, and whichever terminology you want to use, it happened. It's been happening since at least the 50s. We've got examples of adverts used in magazines and things going on. And just to sort of comment on who else is doing the work, I mean, we've collected lots of examples through the years of requests made online, and a lot of PhD students doing the work for students at other institutions kept coming up in that. So that's another group. And I think that sort of ties in quite well what Phil just said regarding people who don't have a lot of money, who are quite able to write, quite skilled in their area, and then they're moonlighting in that way.
I kind of wanted to ask a question back, comment in one, and to link back to what, I'm sorry, the lady in the back was talking about.
Litza.
And kind of teasing at this idea of the ethics of it. And I wonder if there are people here working really not just on the kind of moral decisions that students make, but trying to treat the ethics of the writers and the ethics of the industry more generally. Because I think when I first introduced the idea of what I'm studying, to academics or to people involved in higher education, there's a kind of a gut, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is so awful, surely this must be illegal, the type of comments that we heard. But in terms of normalizing and legitimizing, I guess working with writers in the industry, the ethics kind of get subsumed into the practicalities of real life, and being able to make ends meet. So again, it's a kind of a question for us to start thinking, or for somebody to start thinking more deeply about the ethics involved at every level.
If I could just respond to that, I mean, here's a really big question for us to ask. How many, not in this room, I'm sure, but academics accept gift authorship on a paper where they have done nothing? There's an awful lot of benefit in claiming credit for a paper you didn't write. Isn't that a type of contract cheating? But those same academics might be repulsed and upset and have that reaction about contract cheating by students. So we have, it's not like academics and researchers are squeaky clean in this regard. That is for sure. Really good point, Chloe.
Can I ask one? This is for everybody to discuss. I mean, just wanted to ask you that most of the universities, at the end of the module, we always get the module feedback from the students, and then most of the time we are worried about the numbers. So it's from our university is number 1 to number 5. Anything towards number 5, your module is good, and that's what we throw away in the bin. But I started reading the student comments. Sometimes they write comments. Sometimes, most of the time it's a rubbish comment, about Dr. Shiva is really rude or something like that. But some students, they suggest, I mean, this is about the student union representative from the UK, she's there anyway, is that some students, they suggest the change in the assessment. And have you ever tried their suggestion? Because I started trying and it sort of worked.
Microphones down the front, please. Down here. And there's a microphone needed for Debbie here in the middle as well. If there's a second mic roving, one there as well. They seem to be disappearing. If you have a mic, hand it over. Oh, we've got one up there as well, being ready to be used. Okay.
Hi, is that on? No. Is that on? Hi, Wendy Sutherland-Smith from Deakin University in Australia. Yes, Shiva, it's actually part of our university's policy that when students make comments, not only is the person who is the module or unit or subject, whatever the title is that you call it, in charge of that unit, actually it's part of the terms and conditions of their contracted service that they are required to check the students' comments, and that they are required in the following semester's offer of that particular module to inform the students on the very front of the module what they have done to respond to legitimate comments. As you say, there are a number of comments that can perhaps be put to one side, but there are often comments around assessment that students will raise, and a lot of the comments are in terms of the volume of assessment or the timing of assessment. Timing is a very common one, that everything comes at once. Why can't all of you academics in the same department get it together and not have us having to submit things all in week 4 on this day? So we are required to actually address that. Sometimes students do, of course, make interesting suggestions about assessment, like, well, we shouldn't have any. There should be no assessment in this unit. So, it has to be tempered, but yes, it's actually a requirement.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is that I got a comment from the student that we are going after ghostwriters is the fact that you are expecting us to research a lot within 2 weeks, and he suggested, why can't we do the assessment with the help of remove the ghostwriters and you become ghostwriters to us. Help and do it, and that's what we did. We introduced a scale up, we call it scale up session, where the lecturers will be there, students will be making notes, and we will be asking the questions rather than giving the answers. That worked actually is a student suggestion. So sometimes if you read the student suggestion, we can get some interesting suggestion to improve ourselves here.
Great. Now I'm watching the time. I know we've had someone waiting very patiently to ask a question at the back there.
Hi, I'm Jo Hinchcliffe, Associate Registrar from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, so probably the farthest traveler here. My question is, contract cheating is not a term that we use in my university. We actually call it unethical tutoring. And we've talked a lot about ghostwriting, but what I find is, in my experience, what is more common is exam writing and giving answers to exams and answers to midterms, etc. And we haven't talked about that much, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, if that is part of your contract cheating world. I mean, it should be. And for us also, we actually have had physical fighting on campus between dueling tutoring companies, which I find extraordinary, but it's easy to kick them off campus when they're caught fighting. And they do, Shiva, you talked about targeting students. They do target, for us as Chinese students, and they target them, and coercion is actually often part of the mix as well, like you do this or else. But my question around this exam thing and midterms and getting answers and stealing them is the involvement of teaching assistants, because that's a big deal that I'm dealing with right now, actually, in a case back home, in terms of our teaching assistants having access to answers and keys and questions in exams and how they are implicated in it. And, my question is, how have you dealt with this? And we're just having to think about the teaching assistants as a union, so they're employees, and so how do you divide like the employee part from the student part? And if they're caught, what can we do? It becomes an employee thing, and it gets very complicated. But we haven't talked much about that, and I'd like to hear how you see that fitting in with the whole contract cheating thing.
Okay. I think really there's about 10 questions rolled up there, so I'm not sure which bit of it I'm going to answer. In terms of terminology, there's lots of terminology that could be used. One of the reasons that I move away from ghost writing is because that's the assumption that the only type of contract cheating that happens is in written subjects. My background is computer science, so a lot of my interest developed from computer programming, which can be outsourced to somebody with very little English ability because it's a different system entirely, but we see contract cheating across arts, music, all kinds of other disciplines there anyway. So it's sort of a wider discussion and where tutoring goes into that. I did talk a little bit about exam cheating this morning, but it's a widespread subject. We could have a whole conference just looking at it and the problems. I think exam cheating is more common than contract cheating. I mean, you've got the evidence, Tracey, from your survey. We had similar results, I believe, from our CP work, or at least relatively small samples for some of this. But in a lot of countries, exams are much more common than coursework. So people are developing ways to cheat in exams. And so there's a huge amount of stuff to think about in terms of exam design, as to how appropriate an exam is, and as to what balance of assessment of different types across a module gives us some reasonable assurance that the student has done most of the work for that module themselves, because there is no single solution to contract cheating. And in terms of teaching assistants, I think our UK system is probably slightly different in as far as that works in many cases. But I don't know if teaching assistants necessarily need to have answer keys, for instance, at the time a test is set, because tests can be administered separately. I mean, it's just like Shiva mentioned in terms of module feedback and module evaluation, whereas I'd like to think we all make changes based on module feedback and we all address it and we have a formal process. But I'm certainly used to an idea that an academic in charge of the class doesn't give out those forms and they don't administrate that process. It goes through somebody independent, and then the sanitized summary, removing any particularly hurtful comments, etc., goes back to the teaching team to address. Because otherwise you just got what I know happened 20 years ago in the UK. Lecturer gives out the forms, they filter out all the people who've given it 1 star and put them in the bin before they hand it over for somebody to process.
I know we have so many more questions, and I think the panel has done a brilliant job of answering so many interesting questions today. Our time, unfortunately, is over, and we have many more exciting things to do before we do break for our lunch. So please join me in thanking the panel.